And for disrespecting God's property, he immediately saw a hand writing on the wall. That message to him was a message of doom, because you don't disrespect God's property. That same night, this great Babylonian empire was conquered and divided up into two nations, the Medes and now the Persians. We find that in the Medes, Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. But this was a setup for a comeback for God's people. The kingdom has been split, and under a new king, the Israelites will be allowed to return back to Jerusalem. So after the book of Daniel, a little history comes to the book of Ezra. We find that the second Exodus takes place from Persia back into Jerusalem. They are allowed to return back to the place where their fathers were. For they return not to the same Jerusalem that they once knew. Burned down, walls destroyed, temple wiped out, laid waste in the middle of the desert. But it took some time. The temple was rebuilt finally after prophets Haggai and Zechariah came to encourage the people that the work of God must continue. So there lay God's chosen people, unprotected, no wall, a disgrace amongst the other nations. Which brings us to the point of Nehemiah. The time frame from the book of Ezra to Nehemiah was about 13 years. So for 13 years, Israel laid unprotected and in disgrace. But now this focus is shifted to Nehemiah, a cupbearer to the king. A Jewish cupbearer to a Persian king. For a cupbearer had a great position of trust. And what he did is, before the wine or whatever was brought before the king, he would taste it to make sure the king wasn't poisoned. That's favor within itself. Because if it got poisoned, he was dead. But that's God's favor. Because back in those days, as we found out in Sunday school, assassinations took place often. Everybody wanted to be king. Nehemiah, while in the palace, receives word that Jerusalem lays unprotected, burnt down. So they said to me, found in chapter 1, verse 3, they said to me, those who survived the exile are back in the province and are in great trouble. The walls of Jerusalem is burnt down, and its gates are burnt with fire. It goes to say that when Nehemiah heard these things, he wept. Day in and day out, Nehemiah thought about his people. Although he lived in the palace, ate from the palace, slept in the palace,